Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, we saw how in shock the royal family was, and those who worked for King Edward, that he decided to leave the throne. When King George V was having his health scares, the Prince of Wales started to think about his future, and he didn't think he wanted that position. The Prince of Wales's father had the intuition to realize how he felt. The Prince of Wales wasn't representing his position very well. He was a playboy and he loved just hanging out and drinking with his friends. Once he became king, he pushed to have Wallis Simpson with him. This didn't sit well with the royal family or members of the English government. She was a twice divorced American and she seemed to hang out with the Germans. They didn't trust her. She was pushing the King of Wales to hang in there, but I don't know if his heart was really in it. He decided to resign, and then the Duke of York, his brother, became king. So let's see what happens next. That Christmas, it was a time to reflect on all the events that had happened. Princess Elizabeth, who was 10 at the time, and Princess Margaret was 6, also needed time to absorb all that happened. Their parents didn't say anything to them while it was going on. Queen Elizabeth spoke to her children the day after their father took the throne, and Princess Margaret said, "Isn't this all a bore? We've got to leave our nice house now." Little Elizabeth was awestruck at the sight of the envelope that was addressed to Her Majesty the Queen. The princess said, "That's Mummy now, isn't it?" Now the whole family was under the spotlight. Their mother did try to shield the girls from publicity. Now being queen, she had less time to devote to her daughters. Her job was to support and encourage her husband. King George VI celebrated his 41st birthday on December the 14th, and he bestowed his wife the Order of the Garter. She was happy and wrote to Queen Mary to tell her the news. She said, "Bertie had discovered that Papa gave it to you on his birthday, June the 3rd, and he felt it was charming and he wanted to do the same." Queen Mary was moved by all the kind letters she received, and she asked her son's permission to issue a message of thanks to the British people, and the king agreed to it. Cosmo Lang wrote the message for her. She declared that her heart had been filled with distress when her dear son laid down his charge. "I commend to you his brother, summoned so unexpectedly and in circumstances so painful, to take his place. With him I commend my dear daughter-in-law, who will be his queen. May she receive the same unfailing affection and trust which you have given me for 26 years." Queen Mary was shattered by the abdication, according to her daughter-in-law. It very nearly killed poor Queen Mary. There is indeed such a thing as a broken heart, and hers very nearly collapsed. She was widowed, and she felt abandoned by her firstborn, and she wanted to gather the rest of the family around her to try and recreate as much possible the atmosphere that she and King George V had created for both family and household. December 22nd, the family left for their traditional Christmas at Sandringham, except for a short break, and then they stayed there until the end of January. Queen Mary, who was stressed out, spent most of the Christmas week in her own set of rooms. Queen Mary was relieved when the new king was able to stop the sale. This was a sale of thousands of acres that belonged to Anmer and Fletcham Farms, part of the Sandringham estate. The king loved the place, and his brother didn't. To the relief of retainers and household alike, he immediately reversed many of the other changes proposed by Edward VIII at both Sandringham and Balmoral. Owen Morshead was invited to Royal Lodge the weekend after the accession, and then to Sandringham. He found the king and queen exceedingly kind and frank. There was only one topic of discussion. It was Edward VIII and his casual manner of handing the reins to his brother. "Here you are. I can't do it. You take it on." The king and queen remembered his extraordinary personality, his amazing power of charming people, his flair for making any party go. The queen was concerned that if he parted with Mrs. Simpson, it would be dangerous to have such a powerful personality, so magnetic, hanging around doing nothing. There wasn't a Christmas broadcast that year, but the king released a New Year message dedicating himself to the peoples of the British Empire. He said, "I realize to the full the responsibilities of my noble heritage. I shoulder them with all the more confidence in the knowledge that the Queen and my mother, Queen Mary, are at my side, to repeat the words used by my dear father at the time of his silver jubilee. My wife and I dedicate ourselves for all time to your service, and we pray that God may give us guidance and strength to follow the path that lies before us." The two queens agreed, on their shared duty, which was to sustain the king. The new queen thanked her mother-in-law for her unfailing sympathy and understanding during those first few days when they were stunned by David's going. It was wonderful, she said, to have the old family atmosphere again. She thought it was their great strength in those difficult days. Queen Elizabeth was also getting support from the wider circle of the royal family as well. The king's great aunt Beatrice, Queen Mary's niece Mary, and Princess Alice. Queen Mary wrote to thank Cecilia Strathmore for her sympathy over the ordeal she had suffered. She thought that things worked out for the best. She felt that Bertie and Elizabeth would carry things out in the same way that King George V did. She said that Elizabeth is such a darling and is such a help to Bertie. And Lady Strathmore agreed. She had been horrified by the events of the last few months, and she found it hard to believe that her darling little daughter was now the queen of this great empire. The queen told Queen Mary that she felt very emotional at this time. She and her husband were worried that the people would not like them, and that King George VI would be seen as a poor substitute for King Edward. Friends and family advised them to take things quietly and allow the public to get to know them and their new role. The king at first thought that he could never properly play the role of king. The king would have a relentless daily grind of work. The king depended on his wife's reassurance and her ability to calm his worries. The queen helped the king, and she also kept busy replying to the flood of letters that landed every day on her desk. They were from friends and strangers. In the letters they expressed relief that the uncertainty was over, and some felt confident that she and her husband would, much more than Edward VIII, embody the solid values of King George V and Queen Mary. Queen Elizabeth in one letter stated that everything seems like a bad dream, but the curious thing is that I am not afraid, inadequate, but unfrightened. In 1937 there was a malicious campaign of gossip against the king. The king had decided with great reluctance to postpone an accession Dubar in India that his brother had agreed for the winter of 1937 to 1938. This led some to think he was weak and frail. Cosmo Lang had stirred things up a little by criticizing the Duke of Windsor's behavior. He had also drawn attention to the new king's speech defect. The Archbishop's remarks were unfortunate, and they led to the public to expect serious problems with the new king's diction, and this in turn increased the king's nervousness. It was being whispered that although he appeared to be normal, he was in fact unfit to be king. Supporters of the Duke of Windsor claimed that the King George VI might not even be able to survive the coronation, let alone all the duties of kingship. And the Duke of Windsor's own behavior didn't help. Queen Elizabeth was to blame, according to some, that her brothers, once so close, deteriorated their relationship during 1937. Queen Elizabeth wasn't to blame. The bad blood that arose between the two brothers was sad, but perhaps inevitable. The queen felt her husband needed all the possible help to resist the real, but she thought, improper demands of his brother. He was almost alone in Austria, separated by Mrs. Simpson until her decree absolute came through at the end of April. The Duke of Windsor spent a great deal of time on the telephone. He kept calling the king, and he started to advise him what to do. And I was thinking, I bet that didn't go over too well, because he had no right to say what he should do on the job when he didn't want to do the job himself. And the king had always admired his brother. The Duke of Windsor was quick in understanding and decision, and good on the phone. King George VI didn't have the same quick news, and he was troubled by the impediment in his speech. The Duke's advice was sometimes against what the government was advising the king. Another difficult thing was the Duke, by the end of January, was constantly calling about money, about returning to Fort Belvedere, about his attendance at the coronation, about members of his family coming to his eventual wedding, and above all, about Mrs. Simpson's title when they were married. Arguments over these issues were painful for all concerned throughout the early months of 1937 and thereafter. The king's brother-in-law, Lord Harewood, knew that the Duke was a threat to the king on a personal and a political level, and thought that it was essential to keep him out of the country for 5 or even 10 years. He thought that the king should treat his brother's return as a matter for the cabinet to decide. The king and queen knew that there were all levels of the country that were still divided, and then there was malicious rumors about both the kings. February 15th, the king and the queen had to move to Buckingham Palace. They didn't want to leave their happy home in 145 Piccadilly for the palace. Queen Elizabeth said that this move was the worst house move of her life. It was understood that the king and queen would only use rooms on the first floor formerly occupied by King George and Queen Mary. The rooms weren't ready for them yet, and they lived temporarily on the ground floor, and it wasn't very comfortable. The princesses, though, enjoyed playing in the broad corridors, and the queen set about getting new furnishings with the help of her mother-in-law, and this time her help was welcome. When she was the Duchess of York, the queen had 2 ladies in waiting, and now she was going to have 9. Queen Mary, she was feeling happy. She wrote to her son and daughter-in-law after Easter to say, "What a joy it's been to me to feel that the beloved old house is in such good hands, and that you 2 dear beloved people still carry on the traditions which dear Papa and I tried to do in memory of our ancestors and of the wonderful history of Windsor." The king and queen were having to prepare for the greatest event in their lives, the coronation. Much of the basic planning had already been done, but 5 months was not long enough to complete the preparations, particularly now that a queen was to be crowned as well as a king. The queen's crown had to be created. The crown's jewelers, Gerard, were summoned to Sandringham in January to suggest design. They produced sketches, and those that the king and queen thought possible were mocked up in painted metal models. After having a difficult time deciding whether to have 8 arches or 4 arches, they ended up choosing a model with 4 arches. The majority of the stones for the new crown came from the dismantled regal circlet made for Queen Victoria in 1853 and remounted for her in 1858. The band of the circlet was replicated in platinum and had been set with 16 large diamonds between 16 crosses and surmounted by 4 fleurs-de-lis alternating with Maltese crosses. One of these was designed to hold the huge Koh-i-Noor diamond, which is detached or worn as a brooch. The Koh-i-Noor had been incorporated in Queen Alexandra's crown of 1902 and Queen Mary's of 1911. Now it became a part of the new queen's crown. Queen Mary went into planning with vigor. She wanted to break tradition and attend the ceremony for the first time, that a widow of a king would be present in Westminster Abbey to see his successor crowned. She couldn't bear not to be present when her beloved second son went through the ritual that his brother had renounced. She accompanied the queen to Gerard to examine the crown jewels, and she went to the abbey to see the preparations, in particular the creation of the royal box, and she advised on the color of the ribbon for the king's order, and she worried about how the princesses should travel to the service. The queen got her old dressmaker, Madame Hanley Seymour, to make the coronation robes, because she would have been heartbroken if she wasn't allowed to make them. The robe was traditional, resembling that which Queen Mary had worn in 1911, and that robe had reflected the one that Queen Alexandra wore in 1902. It was combined, a cape and a train. The white ermine shoulder cape was fastened on the shoulders with white satin bows and with a gold cord and tassels. The train was of purple velvet, 44 inches wide and 18 feet long. They had symbols of the British Empire: the rose, thistle, shamrock, leek, maple, acacia, fern, and lotus, embroidered on the velvet with gold thread. The dress itself was fashionably bias-cut white satin with square, delicate and slashed sleeves flounced with old lace. It was embroidered by the members of the Royal School of Needlepoint with diamante emblems of the British Isles and the Empire. 3 rows of gold galleon lace ran around the edge of the train. The Queen's shoes were made by Jack Jacobus of Shaftesbury Avenue. They were white satin high heels decorated with English oak leaves and Scottish thistles. The 2 princesses were measured for their own robes of purple velvet, lined and edged with ermine capes tied, like their mother's, with gold cords and tassels on the shoulder. For the maids of honor, Norman Hartwell created stiff white satin dresses with embroidered garlands and pearls diamante. As the coronation approached, the king was getting more and more nervous about how he would deal with the strain of it, and if his stammer would be an issue. Cosmo Ling had suggested they get a new voice coach, but Lord Dawson rejected the idea at once. saying the king had confidence in Lionel Logue. And the king was also helped by a BBC sound engineer called Robert Wood. He spent many hours teaching him how best to use the microphone. The few days that were left before the coronation was spent at Royal Lodge and Windsor Castle. After a relaxed lunch May Day, they drove through cheering crowds to Wembley Stadium for the FA Cup final. Sunderland beat Preston North End by 3-1. They were touched when more than 90,000 people sang "God Save the King." So I will stop the video here. It's been a trying time for the new king and his family, as they had to move from their much-loved home on Piccadilly into Buckingham Palace. And just when it was thought that the Duke of Windsor, the abdicated king, was gone for good, he started to call his brother, trying to give him advice. He also wondered when he could go back to Belvedere and what his soon-to-be wife's title would be given. The government felt that he should not be allowed to come back into the country for 5 or even 10 years. I also didn't know that at the time some people didn't think the new king was healthy enough for the king's job, and I wonder if they were fans of the abdicated King Edward VIII. The coronation was on everyone's minds. There was certainly a lot of work to be done to make it a success. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help my channel out. And I wish everybody a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you.